Welcome to Midnight Shadows. Today, we're diving into a terrifying true story about a bizarre creature that shook an entire small town, the Flatwoods Monster. On a dark night, after a strange light streaked across the sky, locals reported seeing a chilling figure in the distance. Was it an alien being or merely a cruel trick of the imagination? We'll explore the evidence and hear from witnesses as we unravel the mystery. Is this a horrifying true tale, or just an elaborate hoax? Get ready for a spine-chilling journey. And remember, not everything strange can be easily explained. Now, let's get started. Music. It's the story of the Braxton County Monster. When this story broke, it stretched the imagination of many people around the world. The tale has been told and retold over the past 16 years in nearly every country. There's a story I covered a few months back, one of my favorite paranormal tales of all time. If you watched that episode, I'm going to do a very brief recap here, as I think it's important for tonight's case. So please indulge me. On a May afternoon in 1973, two children were playing together in a field when they heard a strange sound that caught their attention. A sort of wailing, almost like an ambulance, but as though it were being pushed through a large speaker system. Intrigued, the two children traveled through multiple fields to find the source of the sound. It stopped when they arrived at an area with a small bridge over a brook flowing underneath. The pair went across the bridge when something appeared from underneath. A strange figure of sorts. He was nearly 7 feet tall and had the neck for his head appeared to be wedged straight onto his shoulders. He wore a yellow pointed hat that interlocked with the red collar of a green tunic. A round black knob was fixed to the top of his hat, and wooden antennae were attached to either side. His face had triangular markings for eyes, a brown square nose, and motionless yellow lips. Other round markings adorned his paper-white cheeks, and a fringe of red hair fell onto his forehead. Wooden slats protruded from his sleeves and from below his white trousers. He had 3 fingers in his blue gloves and bare white feet that also had 3 toes. This being retreated to a small metallic hut with no windows before returning with a microphone. The children began attempting to communicate with him, which he managed to do in a stilted manner, communicating the phrase, "Hello, I am All Color Sam." The children asked him if he was a man, to which he replied no. Although the children described his speech as odd, his lips wouldn't move, and his voice was muffled as though his mouth wasn't fully opening or was obstructed in some way, almost as though his appearance were some sort of outfit worn on top of something else. However, no reference was ever made to seeing the appearance of a mouth beyond the mask, if it were one. When the children asked if he was a ghost, he replied, "Well, not really, but I am in an odd sort of way." As the children pressed further to ask what he was, Sam simply replied that they already knew what he was. He then went on to say something that was only briefly mentioned in that episode, but it's the important point I wanted to make. When the children asked Sam if he was alone, he said quite matter-of-factly, "No, there are others like me." It's easy to dismiss the case of the Sandown Clown as just the work of imaginative children, or even an over-imaginative father, if you know where that story went next. But I can't shake the small amount of similarities I keep noticing between many cases where people claim to meet strange beings. Sam, the Mothman, and another case we've spoken about here. And of course, the subject of tonight's story, the Flatwoods Monster. Join me tonight as we discuss the creature from Braxton County, a visitor from outer space, West Virginia's pre-Mothman cryptid. Or is he something else? Maybe just like Sam, we should know exactly what he is. So, get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights, and get comfortable. It's time to meet Bray, or as most of us know him, the Flatwoods Monster. As is often the case with stories like this, the exact details tend to differ depending on who is telling the tale. We will get into some of the apparent discrepancies later, but I will attempt to lay out what apparently happened in West Virginia in 1952 as best as I can. The beginning of our story actually takes place decades after it all ended. Ashley was in her grandmother's home, going through old boxes, packing away many of her grandmother's belongings, and throwing away what she no longer needed. That's when Ashley found something, 3 pieces of paper with typed words on them. She may not have given it a second thought if it were not for the title, Unexplained Experiences. Ashley asked her grandmother, Audrey Harper, what this was all about. Audrey told Ashley that she would believe her, but she should read it for herself, which she did. Audrey started the account by explaining that she had moved to Hears, West Virginia in 1950, just a few years after getting married. The roads at the time could be treacherous, and often the only way to make it to the local store was to take a 5-mile trek, cutting through fields to make the journey quicker. One day, late one summer afternoon in 1952, Audrey was doing just that, walking through a field with a friend. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, but it wasn't fully dark yet. They still had time to get home before darkness engulfed the countryside. Suddenly, they spotted something on the hill next to the field, a small orange glow. The two girls quickly identified it as a campfire and didn't think much of it as they continued on their journey. However, the closer they got, the more they noticed that this apparent campfire had a sort of defined shape to it. It looked like a ball of fire just sitting on the ground. They thought they couldn't be seeing it right. Their eyes must be playing tricks on them. But then, the ball began to move, rising from the ground and floating in the air. By this time, the girls were close enough to see it clearly. They still couldn't understand what exactly they were witnessing, but they knew this was no campfire. They began to get nervous, debating whether they should go back in the other direction. Then, out of nowhere, the ball extinguished itself before suddenly taking on a totally different shape. The formerly glowing ball of light quickly morphed into a larger black object, which seemed to take on the form of a person, taller than any person could be, but shaped like a person nonetheless. However, it had no features. It was just a black silhouette. Understandably, the two girls freaked out, running as fast as they could to get out of the field. They reached a nearby barbed wire fence and didn't hesitate to throw themselves over it, not looking back. When they reached the next fence, which had a gate, they stopped to open it. Audrey's friend looked back and screamed, "Oh my God! Audrey, it's right behind us!" Audrey turned to see the black shape, just feet away from them. The two women ran, like their lives depended on it. They never saw anything like that again. And Audrey told her granddaughter that she never dared to venture through that field again. But an incident took place just a few weeks later, only a few miles from that encounter, which convinced Audrey that it must be connected. In the 1950s, pop culture was awash with tales of flying saucers and monsters from outer space. But it wasn't just on cinema screens. Reports of unidentified flying objects were rife at this time, not just in America, but all around the world. Much of this could be seen as a reflection of an increasingly paranoid world still dealing with the trauma of World War II and the constant threat of another, even more deadly war breaking out at any time. However, many of these reports were treated very seriously by the government. In 1952, the year of Audrey's account, there were many major UFO sightings. Although her experience wouldn't necessarily fit that narrative, the incident that took place just weeks later certainly would. Just months before, the country had witnessed the Washington UFO flap, which involved hundreds of reports of unidentified flying objects, including objects being spotted on radar by air traffic controllers flying over the White House. I feel this context is important to put you in the mindset of the kids who were playing football late one afternoon on September 12, 1952, in Flatwoods, West Virginia, a small town in the center of the state with a population of less than 300 people, surrounded by hills, dense forests, and miles of darkened back roads. It was the sort of place where you might almost expect to see a monster. The exact number of kids playing that day appears to be up for debate, but there were seemingly around 11 of them, including brothers Ed and Fred May, when one of the youngest suddenly stopped playing and stared up at the sky. The others, noticing something was wrong, all began to stop when a young boy said, "Hey, look at that!" The kids all looked up to see something moving through the sky above their heads. They described it as a shape somewhere between a pair of hearts and the ace of spades. It appeared to be on fire, glowing a sort of red that kept pulsing to orange and then back to red as it passed by the slowly setting sun. The object seemed to be about the size of a small house, and they were sure it wasn't a shooting star or anything like that. It was too close and looked like a ball of flames. The boys all watched, transfixed by the object as it headed toward a nearby hill, the same hill that the May brothers' family home was located by. The object seemed to reach the top of the hill before suddenly pausing and then slowly descending behind the peak. Despite the view of the object now being obscured, the pulsing light could still be seen peeking out from above the hill. The strange way it seemed to come into contact with the ground didn't fit into their idea of what they had just witnessed. The boys all thought they had seen some sort of meteor, and one of the older boys mentioned that in school they had been told the Geological Society would be very interested in any meteors or other objects that fell from the sky. So, a plan was formed to head over to the site where the meteor had crashed to see if they could discover anything. As they were going past their home anyway, the May brothers suggested they should get their mother involved. They rushed into the house, telling Kathleen May what they had seen. A distant cousin of the boys, an 18-year-old National Guardsman named Eugene Lemon, was there that day, and with them was a pet dog named Richie. Together, they set out further up the hill toward the site where they believed the impact had occurred, the Bailey Fisher Farm. It was easy enough to find, as it wasn't dark yet. The sun was setting, and the pulsating light was flashing against the tree line, growing brighter the closer they got. It was the sound they noticed first, a sort of hissing. Kathleen would later describe it as almost like bacon frying. Then they saw it, the object that had flown over their heads. It was indeed shaped a little like a pear, with the blunt end placed down on the ground. The entire object was pulsing an orange light, but at least one of the kids would later describe it as a black object that was just about visible beneath the bright lights. They then realized it seemed to be surrounded by a low fog close to the ground. The dog instantly became defensive when it saw the object and ran right up to it, barking. The closer it got, the more that fog engulfed the poor animal, which suddenly began to howl before turning on the spot and running as fast as it could away from the object, apparently dashing out of the farm and all the way back home, leaving the group behind. There are many accounts of this story that claim the dog was later found back at the May home, dead on the porch with vomit all around. However, the May brothers have stated in recent interviews that this was just a fabrication added later. The dog apparently lived a full life after this encounter, so don't worry. After the dog left, however, they began to realize that the hissing sound they were hearing wasn't coming from the object. One of the kids said they saw something in the trees, and Eugene moved his flashlight over to a tree not too far from where the group was standing. There they saw it. Kathleen claimed that Eugene's flashlight lit it up like a Christmas tree. There was a figure by one of the lower branches of a large tree. It was kind of human-like in shape, but they estimated it to be somewhere between 10 to 12 feet tall. Even more disturbing, it was floating in the air next to the tree branch. It had large eyes that generated light, almost like a dim flashlight, and it was moving its head from side to side, almost as though it were scanning the area below the hill with the beams from where its eyes should be. All terrified, but none more so than Eugene, who screamed as he saw the being, dropped his flashlight, tripped over one of the children, and then ran away from the others, much like the dog had done. The others remained for a short while longer, almost frozen to the spot with fear. They claimed their memory of the incident was a little fuzzy. Whether this was a result of the intense adrenaline or something else, they couldn't say. Despite it being referred to as a monster after the incident, the boys did not believe it was a creature at all. While the group described it as having claw-like hands, its head had a shape on the back that resembled a spade, not too dissimilar from the glowing object. The way it moved was kind of mechanical, awkward, and robotic. The eyes, as they described them, were more like portholes that allowed it to beam out light. It didn't have legs. Instead, it was just solid on its lower half. One of the boys even went so far as to describe it as more like a missile than a creature. But there certainly was some kind of intelligence to it, because once Eugene had run away screaming, the being turned its attention to the group, pointing those beams from its eyes at them. Then the hissing sound started up again, and the Flatwoods monster began floating down from the tree toward the group. Understandably, They all knew this was the point to get the hell out of there, and luckily the being didn't seem to follow them. The group rushed back to the May home and phoned the sheriff, but he was a few miles away at the time, dealing with another report of someone claiming they had seen a small airplane crash into another set of hills. The sheriff had headed out that way but found no trace of any plane. He then headed over to the May home, but by the time he arrived, there was no sign of any glowing object or the floating being. Interviews conducted after the event revealed that numerous reports had been made across West Virginia, and even further afield, of up to 6 different unidentified objects being spotted in the skies that day. Many of them were reported as either looking like they had crashed or had landed. These 6 objects reportedly made it as far as Alabama before vanishing. Many locals in Flatwoods saw the glowing object in the sky but believed it to be a meteor. While the incident was taking place on Fisher Farm, another farmer had seen the glowing light landing on the hill through his binoculars from about 3 miles away. He told others, and a small group was formed to go and investigate, concerned that it may have been an aircraft crash. However, they found nothing except for a strange burning smell. The farmer claimed he watched a pulsing light for around 15 minutes. It was a flashing red ball, but strangely, with each pulse, it seemed to get smaller before becoming nothing more than a pinpoint and then disappearing completely. The following day, the National Guard was apparently deployed to the area, with a group of 50 men searching Fisher Farm, while a second group searched the Elk River for any trace of the mysterious object. Captain Levitt, the man in charge of the operations that day, said in a later interview that they didn't find much. There was an indentation in the grass that was around 20 feet wide, and they found a sort of black, oily substance over the grass that Levitt described as smelling like sulfur. But seemingly, the Braxton monster wasn't completely gone. Or at least, if you believe the story of George and Edith Snowski, a young married couple who were driving with their young son along a darkened country road later that night, around 20 miles from Flatwoods. As they were driving with no warning, their engine just seemed to slowly lose power before it completely stopped, pulling the car to the side of the road. George reported that he noticed the smell of sulfur and, concerned that something very serious was wrong with the car, got out to take a look. However, he couldn't find any obvious issues. Now, there are 2 slightly different versions of what happened next. One version of the story claims that George saw a bright light in the tree line next to the car and stepped into the woods to investigate. As he moved in, the smell of sulfur increased, and he increasingly began to feel sick. He then saw a strange, large, glowing object in the forest Truakai turning and rushing back to the car. The other version has him remaining at the car, but that a sudden beam of light lit up the area where he was standing. Either way, the end result is the same. George saw on the road, just a few feet away, a giant humanoid-shaped being gliding towards him. The description of this creature is a little different. It apparently didn't have the ace of spade-shaped head attire to it, instead having a reptilian face. George panicked, jumped into the car, and grabbed his wife and child as all 3 huddled on the floor in terror. Apparently, the creature ran one of its clawed fingers along the side of the car as it floated past, before disappearing off into the darkness. Moments later, the Snit-Outsky family's car sprang back into life. The media quickly jumped on the story of the Flatwoods monster, and numerous reports were made about what the May family and their friends had seen. Eugene Lemon and Kathleen May were even invited to New York to appear on a television show segment to talk about their experience, and famed UFO author and investigator Gray Barker came to write about the incident, as well as cryptozoologist expert Ivan Sanderson. The men claimed to interview the witnesses at length, noting that despite interviewing them for days on end, in groups and individually, their stories all seemed to match up perfectly, albeit with them filling in little details that they noticed here and there, which gave the men the impression that this wasn't made up. They weren't following any sort of script. The accounts came across as very genuine, along with the numerous reports of others seeing the glowing objects in the sky and other strange encounters. Although the May brothers, the last remaining witnesses that we know of that are still alive, gave an interview to Small Town Monsters back in 2018 and stated that much of the details that have been added about the Flatwoods Monster have been made up, including many details that the likes of Barker and Sanderson claimed that the children told them. The police officially declared the incident as mass hysteria, and several skeptics claimed that what the group saw on the 12th was, as is often the favorite go-to in these incidents, simply an owl illuminated by Lemon's torch. The May brothers claimed that while the National Guard took samples of the black oil substance, they never said anything about what they discovered after running tests on it. Kathleen May apparently claimed to receive a letter from the government some weeks after the incident. It said that what the family had witnessed was an experimental missile test, and that they advised her not to discuss what she saw with anyone else. Although why the government would reveal its experimental missile plans to this woman, or tell her not to tell anyone just weeks after she had been on TV, I'm not sure. I do wonder whether this may have been a practical joke by someone else. After the initial excitement wore off, the Mays found themselves as something of a laughingstock, with many people not believing their story. They soon decided to stop talking about it, hoping the whole incident would blow over and be forgotten about. And as far as I can tell, they did. It wasn't until the much later interview that I mentioned earlier that Ed and Fred felt comfortable talking about it once again. As one of them states in the interview, they had no proof that this really happened, and they simply grew tired of trying to convince people of what they saw. But while the witnesses wanted to forget all about it, the Flatwoods Monster became something of a local legend, with artwork, merchandise, and events all surrounding the story becoming a permanent part of Flatwoods. The town seemed to embrace its low level of newfound fame as the result of this strange visitor. So what really happened? As I said, the Flatwoods Monster has become something of a local legend. Not quite with the same level of fame as the Mothman incident a little over a decade later, but Braxy, as he had become affectionately called, has become a key figure for those interested in UFO cases and cryptids. As I say, the story of the Flatwoods Monster very quickly became muddied by claims of a fire-breathing, green-eyed monster prowling the forests of Braxton County. However, Ed and Fred really downplay a lot of these incidents. They stand by the idea that what they saw was something mechanical. Their theory is that it was something sent out by the glowing object to investigate the area. They also say that no one got sick from the fog, another commonly misreported incident. However, this does mean either Barker and Sanderson embellished their interviews that they conducted with the witnesses at the time, or that at the very least, some of the children were lying, because the stories they published and spoke about in interviews were a little more outlandish. If Ed and Fred were lying, now it would surely make more sense to go along with the published accounts, which makes me trust them a little more. But of course, they are the only ones still around to share their side of the story, and many have pointed out that their theory of what they saw is a little too similar to the events of the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still. So, was this a case of hysteria, a plane crash, a missile test, an encounter with a creature from another world, or something else entirely? I can't help but think back to the encounter with Sam, the Sandown Clown. How the descriptions of him almost make it sound like something pretending to be human but not pulling it off, its behaviors and appearance just too odd and off-putting. I can't help but think of the High Point Pleasant moth beings that appear to resemble moths, but again, not quite. These entities all take on a form that is similar to things we see in our world, but just a little wrong and twisted. And I can't help but wonder about the story of Audrey Harper from the beginning of this tale, how she saw this glowing object suddenly take on the form of a black, featureless, human-like figure, and just a tiny, tiny part of me wonders, what if these aren't just the works of the imagination from all these people involved? What if there is some truth to them? And what if in some way they are all connected? What if what Audrey saw was these beings before they attempted to take on a form that they believe will be more familiar to us? A ghost, maybe? Not, but maybe in an odd sort of way. That's all for this entry into the tape library. As always, please do let me know any theories you have on this one. 1952 is an absolute mess of UFO reportings, so I struggled to get any concrete information on the apparent 6 UFOs outside of Barker's writings. Could this just be a detail he added on later after stumbling upon this hoax? But so many people in the area do claim to have seen something. Not a monster, but it does seem certain there was at least something in the sky over Flatwoods on that September afternoon. Do you believe the accounts of the May family and their friends? What about the other encounters that were reported? Let me know in the comments below, or if you're listening to the podcast, then feel free to drop me an email. My main sources for this episode have come from the Small Town Monsters documentary on the Flatwoods Monster, an interview with Ivan Sanderson, and Gray Barker's book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. If you've enjoyed this and you want to hear more stories of the creepy and the unexplained, then please do subscribe right now so you don't miss out. You can really help support this channel in 2 easy ways. If you're watching the video, then just click that like button. And if you're listening to the podcast, leaving a rating or review is always massively appreciated. You have no idea how much these things really do help me reach more people. So there's nothing left to do than to thank my wonderful patrons, whose support helped to make tonight's episode possible. Our tape library archivist Xavier Rangel, IMO Grimm, Tyler, Michael Tracy, Terrell, Sandy L, Restock 1731, Mirror, Judith Hacker, Gabriel, Eric Salas, Destiny M, Ash Books, Alex O'Neill, Adlin, Peter McCann, Deppy, Johnny, Dominic Dangels, and Dean J. Daly. The lead archivists, Spell, Brian Baker, Old Soul Like Mine, Lord William, and Al Goldby. And our grand overseers, for Revan, Morning Rain 2619, KT, Agent 355, Brockhampton, and Grim. Thank you all so much for your continued support. And a special thanks to all my junior archivists for keeping the tape library going. So until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams. And if you don't mind, I want to leave you with a classic warning. Everyone listening to my voice tell the world, share this with everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies everywhere. Keep looking, keep watching the skies. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like, share, and comment to support Midnight Shadows. We truly appreciate your support,